Today, most Christians maintain that the book of Genesis says the earth is 6,000 to 10,000 years old at most. Scientists, on the other hand, teach that it is billions of years old. This discrepancy has not only drawn a line in the sand between faith and science, it's also introduced a divisive wall between Christian believers. But what if I told you there was a different explanation that unites young earth evidence, old earth evidence, and scientific evidence together into one harmonious conclusion? How can the earth be young and old at the same time? And what does all of this have to do with Lucifer? Find out right now. Hello, everybody, and welcome to SkyWatchTv. Ladies and gentlemen, those of you joining us from home, I promise you, we are about to start a series that is guaranteed to blow your mind, I promise. But before we dive into today's discussion, let me introduce the explosive panel that's in-house. He's a multi-time critically acclaimed best-selling author and founder of Skywatch Television, Dr. Thomas Horn. She's a credentialed, ordained reverend with a degree in Bible and theology, a powerful voice in Christian television, Donna Howell. His broadcasting career has spanned for more than 40 years. He's the best-selling author of the groundbreaking books Last Clash of the Titans, The Great Inception, and The Second Coming of Saturn, Derek Gilbert. She's one of the lead producers of the forthcoming Rescue Us docu-series from Defender Investigative Films and holds a degree in history for education, Brittany Jackson. And she's the host of the popular Christian television program for women, The Simply His Coffee Shop. Please welcome my beautiful wife, Catherine Horn. Now, I promise that the series that we're starting today is guaranteed to blow your mind, but it may also start a theological war. And that is not an overstatement. We're talking about the brand new book from Donna Howell and Dr. Thomas Horn, Before Genesis. Now check this out, the subtitle: The Unauthorized History of Tohu, Bohu, and the Chaos Dragon in the Land Before Time. And of course, before we started the program, Tom, you said that Gary Stearman required that you read him that subtitle at least 4 times because, you know, he's one of the authorities on old Earth, young Earth, and often thought of as one of the leading scholars on the subject.
Right, several times. And when it was done, he's like, best title of a book ever.
Yeah. And we're also going to be talking briefly about a companion DVD that will go in a special offer that we're making available to you on this new work called What Lies Beneath, The Lost Secrets of the Watchers Below, Göbekli Tepe. I want to dive right into this discussion because I know that with the release of this book, there is this war that will probably accompany its release. And I have to start, Tom and Donna both, as the authors of this book. You guys had dinner with a famous theologian who, out of respect, I will not name, but he said, and I quote, that this book, Before Genesis, the one that I'm holding in my hand, he said that this book would start a war. First of all, what war is he referring to, and why, in lieu of his warning, did you decide to go ahead and publish it anyway? And we'll start with Donna.
I remember this dinner like it was yesterday. It was a conference a number of years ago, and again, out of respect, we won't say who, is a very, very accomplished scholar. Multiple doctorates in biblical-related areas of research. And because some of the different things that were being talked about over that weekend at the conference had to do with science and quantum physics and its relationship with theology, this how old is the earth question got brought up into the conversation. Now, I remember that I was sitting there. I'm part of the old earth crowd, which automatically makes me a walking controversy, you know. But I remember that I was just thrilled with this part of the conversation. Wow, why don't we write this? And, you know, Tom is sitting there going, why won't you write this? He's asking the theologian, partner with me, write this. And he said, if you write this, it doesn't matter what your motive is. It doesn't matter that your goal ultimately is to reach the lost. Pull that scientific community in on a discussion about whether or not science and theology can harmonize. It doesn't matter what your motive is. If you publish this, you will start a war. This is a ministry killer. And of course, that's why he decided not to partner with us. But what I remember sitting there thinking is the whole time I'm circulating in my mind, why do so many people act as if science and theology are two separate things? You know what I mean? Why is that even a question? And I remember that what was going through my head as well is the Herbert Spencer principle. I'm going to read it to you. There is a principle which is a bar against all information, which is proof against all argument, and which cannot fail to keep man in everlasting ignorance. That principle is church tradition before the open mind of whether or not the Bible is actually saying something that the English Bibles are not telling you.
Exactly.
And of course, when you get into the original Greek and Hebrew, you start to find all these things that consistently contradict the traditional teaching of today's church. So I was sitting there thinking, this theologian is saying it's a ministry killer, you're going to start a war. The one thing he said a lot, you are outnumbered. Well, Tom and I, we don't care about the numbers game unless the numbers game is about the lost. If the numbers game is about the lost, that's when we care.
Wow. Yeah, and by the way, what you also didn't say is that he actually agreed with us. He actually agreed that the old Earth theory, as it's popularly referred to, is the correct view of the age of the Earth. But that said, he refused. I couldn't convince him. I tried. I'll pay y'all every day. Oh, you're going to do it. And he wasn't the only one. When I was a pastor, I was formally trained in the Assemblies of God, typical theology, evangelical, mainstream thought. The earth is approximately 6,500 years old. But as a pastor, slowly over time, I started questioning if that was really true. I hated the fact that you have so many people that are secular that they look at the age of the earth and the dinosaurs were millions of years ago, and you dumb Christians, I couldn't become a Christian. I can't take my brain out of my skull in order to become a Christian and deny what is right before us, the soil erosion and all the things of the geological strata of the earth, and also extrasolar planets that have asteroid impacts that we've detected that go back maybe millions of years. They see all of that and they're like, but okay, you got Adam and Eve giving the grandkids dinosaur rides 6,000 years ago, and they just think we're dumb. I don't live my life to try to make them happy, but it did cause me to start questioning, but is this really real, or would there be a way of maybe harmonizing? And I am so excited about this book because, Donna, that's what was accomplished in this book before Genesis. It actually appreciates the position of the young earthers. It agrees that Adam and Eve were created approximately 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, that all of that is a fact. But then what it says is, but before that, something else was going on the earth. Why was the Nakash? Why was the fallen Luciferian angel, Satan, why was he in the garden when Adam and Eve were created? He was already there.
Yeah.
When before that time did he arrive? And so all this stuff started getting in my head. So over time, after we formed Defender Publishing, I started looking for somebody that would write this book for me. I tried to talk Gary Stearman into doing it. Gary has written a lot about this, but I've ran out of patience, and I tried to get this famous theologian to do it. He wouldn't do it either. And I just kept thinking, look, I'm going to get old and fall over wishing this book would have been written. And ladies and gentlemen, you must listen to me. Best book ever published by Defender Publishing, and it does what no other book on this topic has ever done before in the way that it marries all three of these things. It provides appreciation. Anyway, bottom line is I couldn't get anybody to do it, so finally we just gave up, and I said, Donna, we got to do this. With your training in theology and my past history, with experience into doing research and ancient history and all that, we got to do this, and it has come out better than I could have ever hoped for. And hopefully the theologians' commentary won't come true, that we are literally declaring war against tradition, against traditional thought. People become very protective of their way of thinking, and they don't want to allow any other kind of challenge, to what to them is their worldview.
But don't forget that one of the things that he said, will you write this? You're qualified to write this. This whole conversation went on for a while, and he said, well, Tom says to the theologian, do you think we're wrong? have I outlined this in the wrong way? And he said, no. Not only are the conclusions that you are making possible, they're likely. Well, then why won't you write this? Well, you're outnumbered as a ministry killer. So that is the loop that we got stuck in. And the bottom line is not all science is wrong. I'm not suggesting not all science is right.
Right.
Yeah.
Science is allowed to emerge as a voice.
Like the theory of evolution is one of the things that, like the young earthers, they're rejecting that kind of science. But the Bible talks about science falsely so-called, wrong science, right?
Yeah.
And so there are things to be avoided. But the age of the earth, when you get this book and you read it, you're going to read it 10 times, and then you're going to be passing it out to your friends. And you're going to say, man, you need to read what's in this book because this is conclusive material.
My earliest memories, Tom, of you talking about the old earth and the young earth and the science and how do these worldviews that differ so much come together? Is there a path to getting them all to agree? Probably 2008.
Yeah.
That's how long ago I remember Tom. This whole topic, like he wants to get to the bottom of it and see if there's a way to reconcile and, of course, do it authoritatively through the Word of God and come up with a takeaway that all of these communities, if they're open-minded, could agree on. I want to challenge a little bit here, Donna, because a lot of Christians hold a very pessimistic view of what men have kind of frameworked as science.
Yeah.
Or the community of science. This is certainly true in healthcare. This is true in history. People believe there's this historical revision when it becomes convenient to giant companies or giant groups or bodies of academia to go back and kind of historically curate what fits their assertion, their beliefs,
Yeah.
right? To better sales
Yeah.
pitch what they believe to be correct. And so some of our viewers may be a little nervous now. Christians, right? Wait a minute. Donna Howell and Tom Horn are going to somehow try to reconcile the Word of God with science. And I'm not sure I love that. There are many teachings from the world of science that outright contradict the teachings of Scripture, are there not?
Absolutely. And now here's the thing. When the Bible absolutely and irrefutably contradicts Scripture or vice versa, I have no problem saying the Bible wins.
Bible wins.
But here's the thing. First of all, not only is all science not wrong, right?
Right.
We have to define science in a way that people can understand on both sides of the coin to be absolutely objectively true. So when I say science is correct, I'm not saying what mankind has observed in a laboratory, in a lab coat, in a petri dish, or in the world of mathematics or even quantum physics. What I'm saying when I say science, I define science by understanding what is objectively absolute, genuine reality as God has made it. And the observation of that will be tainted. And again, to quote the great Werner Heisenberg, what we observe is not nature in itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning. We're finite.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how close we are to the Lord, how holy, we're finite. We are operating within a limited amount of understanding. The most brilliant minds in the world, what is it, only use 7 to 14% of the human brain, something like that?
Yeah.
We are limited. What we see is not what is real. What we see is what is being observed and looked through the lens of our own method of questioning. So you've got to ask yourself two questions. Question number one, did God create the earth? Yes. Here's question two. Did God inspire the written word, his self-revelation to mankind? Yes. So if God created the world, and he did, and God inspired the written word of God, and he did, merging those two together and finding a thread that complements both and makes them harmonize is nothing short of a genuine act of worship.
Right.
So we need to stop in the church saying, you're just trying to make the Bible agree with science. Why not? If what we are viewing is genuine reality, why is that wrong?
Well, and the Bible agrees with that. The Bible says, doth not even nature itself teach you X, Y, Z about creation and about God? And frankly, all of the great sciences grew out of Christianity. It was man's Christian quest to try to understand God, to understand the nature of reality. All of the great hospitals, all of the great medical sciences, it all grew out of a Christian ethos.
Yeah, being married to a molecular biologist, I can say without fear of contradiction that it is a way of better understanding and appreciating God's creation and the way he has designed at the cellular level, at the subcellular level, this creation in which we live. He designed it specifically for humanity.
Right. So
That's
it
right.
testifies to divine
Yes,
creation, to
absolutely.
divine order.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. Why are we so afraid of it?
Well, let's get into this because the viewers, I'm sure, at this point are saying, okay, you've got my ear. You've made this crazy assertion. You're going to make all these worlds come together and somehow agree with the Bible. Tom, how is it possible that the seemingly dismantled, fragmented conversation, this merger that you're describing, how does this occur without compromising biblical scripture?
Well, it does, because if it's, like she said, if it's uncompromised truth, then it is a statement of fact. When you get into things like Darwinism or whatever, those are theories. They're not really based on science. We have no
Right.
measurable proof that man came from an ape. You have a theory that
Yeah.
happened. But there are apes, and you can study them, and that is science. And there are humans, and you can study them, and that is science. You can study the physiology. So those are just basically, though, the superficial things that we slightly examine when coming into this book to say, don't be afraid of what you're about to learn, because it may question your particular worldview. And what it ought to really do is cause you not to necessarily abandon, like you're a young earther. Don't abandon the idea
Right.
that Adam and Eve were created 6,000 years ago. But is there more to the picture?
Right.
Are you looking at a Mona Lisa and you're so focused on this spot on her shirt that you can't see the picture? You can't see
Right.
the forest for the trees, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And that is kind of how we dive in. And again, like I said a moment ago, Lucifer was already in the garden when Adam and Eve got there. Well, when did that happen?
Right.
Right? We know he was kicked out of heaven. Jesus even said, I beheld Satan like lightning fall from the heavens, right? When did that all happen? It didn't happen in the Garden of Eden. It was already past.
That's right. And also to answer your question about how those three different voices actually do merge, I'm going to give you the spoiler alert at the beginning of this 6-week series, and then we'll spend the rest of the 6 weeks figuring out how this all works together. But first, science and old earth theology actually do agree that the earth is very, very old. Now, how old, that opens up a can of worms, but very old. And at this point, that is all we need to agree on. Young earth sees that something happened. Not just that Adam and Eve came along and humanity began to exist at some point approximately 6 to 10,000 years ago, but they see layers of the earth and something that went, kablooey approximately 6 to 10,000 years ago. What is that? If the earth is very old, and then something happened to it that rendered the planet without form and void, tohu vabohu, which we will get into, does not mean conclusively without form and void. If something happened to the planet, then however long later, an undefined number of years later, God recreates the earth. He re-terraforms the earth's surfaces. He fixes and restores what was lost when the world was rendered tohu vabohu, or without form and void. So what happens is you actually have not two separate creation events, but you have in the beginning, the very beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And then sometime later, this is otherwise known as the gap theory, but we do not go in this standard gap theory. There was a gap in time. And then Adam and Eve came along when the earth was restored. So are you going to see evidence of old earth? Yes. Are you going to see evidence of young earth? Yes. So as Dr. Michael Lake will say, when you ask him, is the earth old or young? Yes.
I know. I've heard him say that. Well, Donna, let's follow that up. Your book is not just another response to the cosmological question. However, there are so many details that are of crucial importance to the conversation that you dove so deeply into. For the audience at home, for those in-house, give us an example of the book's general outline so that our viewers can know what kind of discussion to expect for the next several weeks.
Yes. So we did break the book down into 3 separate parts. Part 1 is the great debate. Okay, now what this does is it takes the different voices, science, young earth, and old earth, and it says, if you're just joining the topic, here's where they argue, here's all the different needles and arrows that get shot from one side to the other, and by the way, here's a couple of major issues they argue over that with this particular approach to the book of Genesis and the recreation or restitutional theory, they don't matter anyway, but this is the debate. And then it talks, in some of these areas in the great debate, it talks about where and how they actually can merge, and they do. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Part 2 is supporting evidence of old Earth, and it's not just science. I got to tell you, a lot of times I hear people, and especially people in the church, Christian people, saying, you can't trust radiocarbon dating. Radiocarbon dating. It's not just radiocarbon dating. There is everything from paleomagnetism to river sediments, all the way over to biostratigraphy. There are so many different things that contribute to the idea that the Earth is very old, but one area that Tom and I specifically spent a very deep trench dig area of the book on is these old archaeological sites. Not just sites that have been radiocarbon dated, but that have symbolism all throughout the entire site. Weird things like serpent worship, things that connect not just historically to the human or possibly pre-human timeline of something that was weird and here before, again, looking back at the Luciferian fall and that whole thing, but also that specifically speaks to the theological history. So these sites were very paramount to a lot of what we did. We have sites like Göbekli Tepe, we have sites like Karahan Tepe, Çatalhöyük, Baalbek, where the largest stones on Earth are found right now. Building blocks weighing 3.3 million pounds. How did a bunch of men with pulley carts in an old civilization, pre-pottery, you can't even construct a clay pot, but you can transport a 3.3 million pound 10 miles from the quarry? So that's what part 2 is about. And then to conclude your question, part 3 actually does say, okay, we've established the fact, young Earth, old Earth, science, blah, blah, blah. What are we looking at in the void era of Earth? That time between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, where the world was without form and void. What are we looking at? Who were the key characters? Who were the key players? What happened? What kind of fall was this? So that is the general outline of the book. Those are the topics that are addressed.
Well, underneath, Tom, with just a couple of minutes on the clock left for this very first installation of this incredible series, for the viewers that follow our program, they probably know that you were a pastor in one of the largest organizations here in the United States for more than 25 years. For those just joining us or new to the program, they may not know that. But while you were tenuring as a pastor at various churches, you would often have both old earthers and young earthers come into your assembly and share their ideas. How did some of those differing worldviews affect or inspire you to tackle this topic?
Yeah, I did do that, and it's because, as you say, I've been interested in this subject matter for a long time, and I wanted people to be able to, in the church, to be able just to make up their own minds. So I would invite somebody from the Creation Institute to come with their best evidence, best argument. I'd give them 1 hour to stand up in front of the audience and speak why the earth is only 6,500 years old or something like that. And then I would bring in a scientist that was a Christian to argue why they believed that the earth is much older than that. And like I say, then the congregants could just decide what they wanted to believe. But I remember in one case, the young earth creationist, he brought a stone with him and he was showing it to us. And he was saying, in the middle of the stone is a gaseous substance. And he tried to say what it was. And he said, there is no way in the world. He said, this gas, if exposed just to the atmosphere, it would dissipate within a bazillionth of a second or whatever. But for that stone to have been formed around it meant that the stone itself had to have been created within a split second. So I just thought that was so impressive. Well, later on it was shown that wasn't true at all, and that stones tend to create gas inside. In fact, we even mine them today. One of the other ones was footprints in dried up lake beds of both dinosaurs and humans, either running alongside each other or being pursued by one or the other. And he thought that was quite conclusive. But again, if you read our book, we're talking about pre-Adamites, human-like individuals that lived on the earth possibly millions of years ago during the age when the dinosaurs would have roamed the earth. So again, that argument fell apart. But that was kind of some of what, back in those days, I thought was very impressive.
And the bottom line is, based on the work of a renowned physicist named Barry Setterfield, that it's possible that, as Dr. Michael Lake says, yes, young Earth, yes, old Earth, because the argument is based on the assumption that the constants that we've been taught, like the speed of light, the rate of atomic decay, are in fact constant. That is not true. The speed of light is actually slowing down. It's been measured. This was an accepted fact until about 1941 when it was just frozen in time. And no, it is a constant. Thou shalt not question the speed of light evermore. Well, that's just not true. If you accept the plasma theory of creation, which is not the consensus view, but again, we're not talking about a fringe physicist here who's proposing this idea that the speed of light decreased extremely rapidly in the moments after creation, and Setterfield calculated that in the first 4 days of orbital time, the first 4 days of time as we know it, something like 6 billion years in atomic time passed. So yes, things may appear to be billions of years old, and yes, that's true, when in fact we may be only looking at a history that's only thousands of years in age.
That maybe a quick recap.
This
for those
is kind of
just joining us.
mind-blowing, and this is based on the work of a Christian physicist by the name of Barry Setterfield. And Barry, if you're watching this, please forgive me because I barely get my head around just the introductory article that you posted at your website. But I think this is foundational, and I think should help Christians say, look, if we've learned nothing from the last several years, it is that the science is not really settled. And this is true in physics as well as anything else. Now, also, please understand as a disclaimer, C- in freshman physics in college, okay? But Barry Setterfield reached out to Sharon and me after watching a couple of our episodes of Sci Friday, a program that we produced for about 7 years.
Right.
And Barry found during his research as a physicist that there are 5 things that are considered constants that are not, in fact, constant. But the consensus of physics is that we do not question these. These are established. Our acceptance of these constants as Christians is what leads to this argument. We're arguing over the number of years when in fact we should be saying, you know what, the way we calculate years is not even settled. First of all, the speed of light is not a constant. Secondly, the mass of subatomic particles is not a constant. Thirdly, the red shift that we observe, astronomers observe at the edges of the universe, is not constant. Fourth, there is something called Planck's constant, which is not a constant, ironically, and the fact that the atomic clock, which is measured by atomic decay, is not a constant because the rate at which atoms decay has been changing over time. And according to Barry Setterfield, this is all due to something called zero-point energy, which again is not in the consensus among scientists, but basically it is this. As the Bible tells us, God tells us in His Word 12 times, He stretched out the heavens. All right? Imagine you taking a balloon and you're stretching it out. What's happening is you are converting potential energy into kinetic energy. Suddenly now there is energy in the rubber of that balloon, except that the rubber in this case is everything, us. And that energy is created in the form of virtual particles, entangled pairs, if you will. Joe, inside your body is about 100 billion virtual pairs. And as light moves, photons, move through the ether, they encounter these particles. When the photon encounters the particles, they immediately, almost immediately, disappear. They are converted back into the ether. And again, Barry, I know I'm barely getting my head around this, forgive me. They slow down that photon. It continues to move, but they slow down the photon an infinitesimal amount. But as more and more potential energy is in the universe, as that rubber is stretched out, there are more and more of these virtual particles that light has to move through, which means that as the universe was stretched, more particles were added into what we call reality, which means that light moves more and more slowly. And this fact has been observed. Now we're in something like what we call the water balloon universe, where things move and shift a little bit because they've noticed since 1970 the speed of light has actually started to pick up again a little bit. So light is not a constant, but the point is this. Shortly after creation, as the universe was being stretched out, the speed of light, as it began encountering more and more virtual particles very rapidly, the speed of light dropped dramatically in the early days of the universe. And according to Setterfield's calculations, based on the observations of the redshift at the edges of the universe experienced something like 6 billion years in the first 4 days of creation.
Oh, wow.
Now, things have slowed down since then. Rate of change has slowed since then. But the point is this. We may be looking at a universe in which old earthers can say billions of years, and young earthers can say, yeah, and thousands of years, and both be right.
That's right.
Derek sits there and he says, I can barely understand that. And then he goes on to explain this stuff. That's what I was thinking. Tom, young earthers are frequently asked, if the earth is so young, why does it appear so old? And they do have answers to this, but according to your tricky God theory, none of those answers are theologically permissible. Is that right?
Yeah, and this also came out of a conversation with Gary Stearman some years ago. Gary and I both espoused the old Earth approach model, and we both have friends that are in the young Earth community too. So, we can sup together and all that. We just happen to disagree on these points. But we were talking about this at a restaurant, and we were going over this stuff, soil erosion and obvious stuff in the, extrasolar planets. I mean, there's just evidence of dinosaur bones, that are dated into the millions of years. If the Earth's only 6,500 years old, why does this appear to be that way? And I just happened to look at him and I said, tricky God, right? Tricky God. That the Earth is only 6,000 years old, but he made it look like it could be millions, if not billions of years old. Now, here's the problem with that, though. And with all respect to my friends that are in the young Earth community, to me, this is borderline heresy. Why? Because if you say God only made it to look old, why would God go about deceiving humanity?
Yeah.
This is
Right.
against the nature of God.
Yeah.
God doesn't practice tricking people,
Yeah.
which is a nicer way of
Trickery.
saying deceiving them. And so, in creating a young planet that looks old, you'd have to intentionally decide to trick humanity, which you cannot do according to Numbers 23:19, Titus 1:2, Hebrews 6:18, many other verses that absolutely are the antithesis of that line of thinking. So that's where that theory came from. Gary and I will often look at each other and smile when we hear somebody, talk about some of this stuff and why God made it to look old when in fact it really isn't old. One of their defenses is, well, wait a minute, God created Adam and Eve like in a flash, in an instant, but they were fully mature, they were fully grown. But Donna, you actually worked on part of the answer to that in the new book.
Well, and it boils down to this. God, in inspiring the written scripture, transparently said, that's what happened with Adam and Eve. He wasn't out to trick anybody or make Adam appear to be young, but he was really old, or appear to be old, but he was really young. He just said that he created it that way. There's no trickery there. But it's a transparency issue. So as Tom said, either all of the science is wrong or God is a trickster.
Yeah.
And he just...
Which he cannot be,
Right.
according to the Word.
Now, with everything that Defender Publishing puts out, Tom, every book, every work that you guys put, every documentary film, the objective is to raise people's awareness of the prevailing message of the gospel.
Right.
So you guys may find some of this fascinating. A lot of people are entertained by some of the archaeological discoveries in the books or the prophetic timeline that's being revealed in the book. But Donna, the undercurrent, the prevailing message is always, and you said this last week, that even though you and Tom may be outnumbered in terms of this other way of thinking being more popular, you'll take the less popular position because you believe it to be more aligned with biblical truth, and to salvage those out there that may be asking legitimate questions who stand to learn about Jesus through a work like this. Your goal is ultimately evangelism. Now, early on in your book, you wrote about a huge evangelism mistake that the church made during the time of Galileo. And you say that event is paramount to this book. What do you mean?
Yeah. The era of Galileo and the 300 years of church history following this grand evangelism mistake, it was a blight on the church history. Let's just call the kettle black here. What happened was he was branded a liberal interpreter, a heretic, because his scientific research with telescopes and his understanding of the planetary movement of space and everything like that, space bodies and how they interact with each other and what moves at what time of year, he had come forward and with written work, very scientifically presented of his day, that challenged geocentrism. Now, geocentrism was the church's understanding of the operation of the universe. The earth is in the middle of the universe and everything moves around it. Well, he came forward and showed very irrefutable science of his day that supported heliocentrism, which is the idea that the sun is at the center of the universe or the galaxy and that everything revolves around it. Well, the church branded him a heretic. They put him under a lifelong house arrest. They said that everything he had ever written would have to be recanted, no longer in distribution. They prohibited everything he had ever touched and basically silenced this guy and said that what he was saying about heliocentrism could not be true, in part because of, for instance, Psalm 93:1 says, the world also is established that it cannot be moved. So they took that literally, and the earth is in the middle and it's not moving, which means the sun has to be the one that's rotating around it, and so on and so forth. There's this big argument. Of course, later on, the church came in and was able to understand that this is a provisionary statement of God establishing the earth for his end time purposes and his overall redemptive goal. So they eventually let that go. But what happened was a 300-year period where there were people who came forward and said, man, I wish I could believe in the Bible. I want to believe in God. But the church is telling me that the only way I can believe in this Bible is if I believe that the earth is at the center of the universe, and my telescope and the testimony of my very own eyes tells me that that's bananas.
Yeah.
So I guess I can't believe in Scripture. That's what happened for 300 years in the time of Galileo and following. So I ask this question. If there is an opportunity to see that there is another interpretation of the book of Genesis that does not hold to church tradition, and respectfully, by church tradition, I mean the young earth interpretation that says you must believe the earth is only 6,000 to 10,000 years old, and if you don't, you're a heretic, or you believe in science, or you are a liberal interpreter. If there's no other way than that, we could be looking at another multi-century time where people say, I want to believe in God, I want to believe in Scripture, but I can't because science is showing me a lot of proof that the earth is older than 6,000 to 10,000 years old. So if I can't believe the first few verses of the Bible
Right,
to
right.
speak truth, I can't accept the rest of the document.
Right.
One of the worst mistakes that church has ever made is to claim that that is the only way to interpret Scripture and everything else is a fallacy.
And I would even add to that, Joe, that what we're talking here, when we say that, like the dominant view, I don't know what the percentages are, but the dominant view that Earth is 6,000 years old or whatever, that actually has more to do with American Christianity that developed here in early American history. There are other places around the world where that would not necessarily be the dominant view. There are churches or organizations in other countries, they don't hold this view at all. But here in America, it is something we have to deal with.
But since we're talking about the potential compatibility between the scientific record and the scriptural record, Donna, lots of viewers are probably wondering what your response would be to Darwinism and the Big Bang. What would your response to that be?
Right, that's the first thing. If you accept anything scientific, you also have to accept that man came from monkeys. And no, Darwinism's out. That one's a quick, easy slam dunk. Adam was made in the image of God, and he is therefore unique. He was not made in the image of a monkey or any other kind of primordial soup. So respectfully, even though there are theistic evolutionists who say that God used randomized evolution, but he just guided it so that it would get there and do what he wanted, I respect them. Like you say, that they are our brothers and sisters, but it's theologically incompatible with the idea of Adam being a unique carrier of the image of God. And it also forces weird incompatibilities with Scripture, like if Adam did come from a long line of monkeys, yet death was not introduced until the bite from the forbidden fruit, were all the monkey men just immortal and perfect? Like, it's just incompatible.
Yeah.
Darwinism's out. All right. Now, Big Bang, real quick. It depends on where you're going with that theistic evolutionism versus, the entire secular idea of it. But there are reasons to believe, as Chuck Missler would share, randomized evolution by itself is absolutely preposterous. Let me give you one example. If I wanted to go down the human biology, we'd be here for 12 episodes straight. One example, watch this. The hemoglobin in the human blood, right? It consists of 574 elements and 22 amino acids, and it is in a perfect sequence together. All of those amino acids and the elements merge perfectly. If they don't, we get what is called hemoglobinopathy, and that is fatal. So the only way that the very first human could have ever existed long enough to produce offspring and, procreate and have generations after him is if that sequence ended up being perfect at some point in our human history, okay? Now, the number of possible mathematical permutations that exist in taking 574 elements and aligning perfectly with 22 amino acids, the chances of that happening by chance, by coincidence, is this number. 10 with 650 zeros following it. 10 to the 650th power. That's the possible permutations, okay? Now, you look at that, And you realize that if the earth is as old as science is saying, this universe has only been around for 10 with 18 zeros following it. So you tell me, how does something that could only happen by chance, in one chance in 10 with 650 zeros following it, happen in a universe that's only been around for a number of seconds that is represented by 10 to the 18th power? What that means is there's not enough seconds in the history of the universe for that to have accidentally happened. And according to Missler, in the world of quantum physics, guys, any number that is 10 with 50 zeros following it is absurd and impossible. So using the human hemoglobin alone, that one part of our blood represents a sequence that makes randomized evolution. Look at what it actually says. In the beginning, there was nothing, and then it exploded. I'm sorry, it's preposterous. So Darwinism's out, randomized evolution is out. Science still remains to be in, because what we look at when we see science is absolutely flawed, and genuine reality as God designed it is not the same thing.
Donna, with a few minutes left on the clock, I know this is a big one, and it's very important to the book. This is one of the main arcs that you guys assert throughout this work. In only the second verse of the entire Bible we read, quote, "And the earth was without form and void," unquote. Scholars for thousands of years have acknowledged that although this is not a bad translation, it is an incomplete translation. What do you mean by this?
Absolutely. It's extremely incomplete. So without form and void comes from the Hebrew rhyming words tohu vabohu. Let's look at those words first. Isolate them as words and see in Hebrew, to the original Jewish readers, what did those words mean? First of all, from James Strong, the celebrated Strong's Concordance, everybody knows that routine, right? Even he says that tohu means to lie waste, a desolation of surface. Automatically and right away, something happened to the surface of this place. Bohu, to be empty of acuity and nothingness. An undistinguishable ruin. That's what these words mean. According to James Strong, let's look at another one. Gesenius Hebrew Chaldee Lexicon says tohu means that which is wasted, laid waste, and bohu means emptiness or voidness. Sound like something God created? Okay, moving on. The Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew English Lexicon says tohu is a formlessness, a confusion. Remember that God is not the author of confusion, the New
Right.
Testament says. Unreality, emptiness, formlessness of primeval earth. And listen to this part, a land reduced to a primeval chaos. That is what this word means. All right, Dictionary of Biblical Language with semantic domains, all right? Tohu, formless, wasteland, what is barren and void of use as tracts of unpopulated land, ruination, destruction, what has been destroyed and in chaos and confusion. One after another, after another. Look, that's just focusing on what people say the word means. Let's move from lexicons for a moment over to commentaries and take what they think that means in the whole context of the whole verse here. Bible Knowledge Commentary here says, such conditions as tohu vabohu would not result from God's creative work. Rather, in the Bible, they are symptomatic of sin and are coordinate with judgment. The Schofield Reference Bible cross-references Jeremiah 4:23 through 26 and Isaiah 24:1 and 48:18, which he says, with all of these taken together, it clearly indicates that the earth had undergone a cataclysmic change as the result of a divine judgment. The face of the earth bears everywhere the marks of such a catastrophe. Like, he's just looking at this like, duh. Right? All right. Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown, one of my absolute favorites. And then we'll move on to another thing. Their critical commentary says, this globe at some undescribed period, having been convulsed and broken up, was a dark and watery waste for ages, perhaps, until out of this chaotic state, the present fabric of the world was made by God to arise. There is nothing about tohu vabohu, without form and void, that can theologically be seen as God's design. Now, before we move on very quickly, of equal importance to all of this, the Hebrew word haya, which is recognized here in English as was, the earth was, without form and void, over and over and over again throughout the Old Testament, it means became. Watch this. Genesis 19:26, just as one example. But Lot's wife looked back from behind him and she became, Haya, a pillar of salt. Brown Driver Briggs says it means fall out, come to pass, become, happen, occur, take place, come about. And it came to pass that. I could go, I brought 25 others, but with only a minute left on the clock, the point is that verse does not say, and it was without form and void. It said it became. Something happened to it that rendered it that way.
Well, that really stands in support. And again, you only briefly mentioned what people will find out when they read the new book before Genesis. The dozens and dozens of references in the Bible translating the word as became. So you would read Genesis 1 and 2 in the beginning. When was the beginning? We don't know. Could have been a bazillion years ago. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, verse 2, and it became dark and void. And chaos, which goes back to much of Derek Gilbert's research into the chaos dragon, the theology of that, it became that. It was a result of something that had catastrophically affected the original creation of the earth. So there is a great deal of support there to back up what people kind of commonly refer to as the gap theory. Verse 1, then there's a gap of time, and something happened. Now verse 2, we start the recreation, and that is approximately 6,500 to 10,000 years ago. God makes Adam and Eve and so forth, and recreates, restores. We'll get into that again in one of these other programs, the verses that say he literally restored the surface of the earth. Well, what happened to make him have to restore it, right? So we'll talk about those things.
Yeah, and it's pretty clear from the other references in Jeremiah 4, verse 23, you mentioned Isaiah 45, verse 18, that the references there to becoming formless and void are in connection with judgment. So it suggests that Genesis 1, verse 2 is also connected to some judgment. As the commentaries you cited, Donna, something happened before God created Adam and Eve and Eden that forced God to bring some judgment onto the earth, which rendered it formless and void.
So some of these verses that they have referred to, let me just read them so that the audience knows exactly what was said. Isaiah 45:18, God himself that formed the earth and made it, he hath established it. He created it not in vain, which is Donna's reference to tohu. So Isaiah is contradicting the theory that it was dark and void and that was the way God made it. He said, no, he did not make it tohu. He formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord and there is none else. George Hawkins Pember, he quotes that same thing in his famous book, Earth's Earliest Sages, and he says, obviously the authors have mistranslated this word. It should be, it became dark and void. Also, scholars point to Psalms 104:30, says, God renewed the face of the earth. So the surface or the face of the earth was restored after something happened to it. So clearly something happened that made the earth that way, and God had to put it back together.
Most old earthers, Donna, would say that the culprit behind the without form and void era of earth was Lucifer or Satan. However, you have identified some clear scriptural teachings that go well beyond the common understanding of who this character really is. Tell us about that.
Yeah. When it comes to Lucifer, there's the understanding of his attitude. That comes from Isaiah 14:12 through 15. In the theology world, they call this the 5 I wills. Isaiah says, how you have fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning, how you are cut down to the ground, which did weaken the nations. For you have said in your heart, here's the 5 I wills, I will ascend to heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit upon the mount of the congregation in the side of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. And here's the biggie. I will be like the Most High. And then Isaiah rounds it out and says, yet you will be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit. So you understand, first of all, that is what is commonly known in the church. A lot of people, they understand Lucifer and the 5 I wills and what happened. Okay, then we get into a description of what he looks like and what his kind of caricature of who he is. Ezekiel 28:12 through 19. And it says, thou sealest up the sum, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. So first of all, we're looking at somebody that is beautiful. The red skin with the horns and the dragon tail and the pitchfork, that's out the window. Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God. Okay, well, first of all, before we go any further, he's on earth, okay? Every precious stone was thy covering, and then the word goes on to mention what these stones are. Now, scholars have taken these different stones that are being listed in a very long list here and compared them to the priestly breastplate of the high priests in the Old Testament, and the kings of the Old Testament, and how they interacted and how they had different relationships with different stones. And if what we're looking at is literal, is that Lucifer, prior to his fall, is anointed in wearing the gemstones of the high priest. So he's at least a priest so far. This is something that's very, very heavily overlooked. The workmanships of thy tabrets and thy pipes were prepared in thee the day that thou wast created. So he was a masterful musician of some kind, right?
Yeah.
Literally built into his creation. Master of music. You wonder where some of that weird satanic music comes from and why it carries with it such a demonic presence and power that you see. You know, you hear those
Absolutely.
testimonies. Thou wast upon the holy mountain of God. Thou hast walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. Thou was perfect in thy ways from the day thou was created until iniquity was found in thee. And I will destroy thee, O covering cherub. He's a cherub. So when you look at what's actually being described here, we have not only a cherub, which is, you know, we can get into this in a little bit if you'd like to, not only the highest creation order of all celestial beings in matters of authority and beauty and presence and commandeering power, but he's possibly a king priest. And I'll tell you that those scholars who have literally looked at the covering stones and all of that, the words about him being anointed, a covering cherub, and the precious stones are literal. Then Lucifer had undergone the ceremonial anointing that consecrates one to follow in the Lord and to lead others to do so in the same manner as the Old Testament kings and priests. So we're looking at a king priest cherub with a lot of authority.
Now, whenever you're saying cherub, are you talking about the little baby type of figure that we see like on T-shirts or in posters?
Yeah,
what do you
no.
mean by that?
Paintings, yeah.
Yeah.
No,
Cute little baby.
No, I'm glad you asked me that. Okay, this goes back to the Byzantine iconoclasm. Now, we don't have time to go into it in great detail, but basically, when we were looking at kind of the Renaissance era and everything that was going on during that time, what happened with the iconoclasm was that there was this religious movement that said anybody who owns religious art is worshiping that religious art because they get all mystical around it or they want to venerate it. So we're done with all religious art. And they put the kibosh in one point in history down on anything that was religious art. Then, when religious art was once again legalized, I'm going over hundreds of years of history here, when it was once again allowed kind of in the church, what they did was they copied and borrowed from the religious artwork that they knew at the time, which was entirely based on the Greco-Roman pantheon. So what we get is this weird idea that angels have wings. No, they don't. We're talking about completely different member of the celestial order here. An angel is a messenger, and they never have wings in the Bible. This idea that the little baby angel, you got to pick him up and burp him. As Mike, remember when Mike Heiser used to say that? if I've got to pick up and burp one of God's major celestial.
He said that?
Yeah. He says it's really hard to believe in the cherubs when you got to pick them up and burp them for them to do anything. No, seriously. No, a cherub was, okay, here's the breakdown. First of all, they were guardians of the Garden of Eden. Right? We read that in Genesis 3:24. They were embroidered into the veil of the Holy of Holies, which we read about in Ezekiel 26. They were crafted in gold atop the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant, where God's presence came to speak to his people. They already have this weird kind of intermediate presence everywhere that we read about in Exodus 25 and number 7. They are the entities who God himself dwells between, the Bible says, as he sits upon his throne. That's in Isaiah, 2 Kings, Psalm, and several other places. And thus they are the top ranking of all celestial beings that God ever made. So clearly this being, this Lucifer, he was stationed in a place of incredible power and authority. And we do get the baby angel idea. We got to understand, first of all, that actually comes, specifically Cupid, that comes from a very perverted god, otherwise known in the Greco-Roman pantheon as Eros. And first of all, he wasn't a baby, he was a teenager, and he was omnipresent. And the arrows that he shot were not arrows of love and warmth, they were arrows of deviant sexual behavior. And he was the one that often had so-and-so cheating on so-and-so, and this person was, of different genders, and all of that stuff that's happening in the Greco-Roman pantheon, a lot of it started with him. It's a very perverted god.
Yeah, eros is from which we make erotic or
Right.
eroticism.
Right.
Yeah.
The cherubim looked a lot more like the lamassu found outside the palace of the Assyrian kings at Nineveh, which was a giant bull-like creature with a human head with the wings of an eagle. In fact, we saw the lamassu at the British Museum. When you looked at them, they had the human head, the wings of the eagle, the body of the bull, and the paws of the lion. In other words, the same four entities described when Ezekiel saw the cherubim, or the cherubim as the Hebrews would pronounce it, in Ezekiel chapter 1 and Ezekiel chapter 10, the guardians of the throne room of God. These were seriously bad creatures that you did not want to mess with.
Now remember, when you look at Lucifer and you're thinking of him as the cherub, right? Earth was his home, his kingdom. We find this all throughout Scripture. He resided upon the mountain of God, Ezekiel says. He was cut down to the ground. That means literally thrown to earth. That was in Isaiah. The ruler of this world, as well as the God of this age, the prince of the power of the air, still working in the sons of disobedience. And it goes on to say he has the authority over all the kingdom of the earth in Luke 4. In theories that you can take seriously, that I know of, there has never been any other conclusion. So it's very important that when we're looking at the void era of earth and wondering who did what and who the culprit was, it's very clear that Lucifer was given earth as his kingdom well before he ever fell.
Now, Tom, in addition to being a king priest, you say that there are links between Lucifer and the serpent family. So does this make Lucifer serpentine or reptilian in his nature?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for instance, he's referred to as a dragon and also as a serpent in places like Revelation 12:9 and 20:2. The serpent or the snake of Eden, the Hebrew Nakash, which literally translates the shining one. Lucifer, that's from Hillel ben Shakar, which literally means shining one or son of the dawn. And so many studies around this character basically describe this as a serpentine, shining, powerful entity that was associated with the divine council that Derek Gilbert and Mike Heiser and others have so readily talked about. Psalms 82:1, Kings 22:19, all of Job, many scholars, again, including Derek, who thankfully is with us today, and I'm happy about that. And Derek will talk about this too. But you go on, Christ's victory over Lucifer, Satan on the cross, was predicted in the most famous parts of the Old Testament, what we call the proto-evangelium, or the pre-preaching of the coming of the Son of Man, when it talks about the seed. The seed of the woman will crush the head of what? The serpent. So all through the Bible, he is directly associated with serpentine iconography. Later on, either in today's show or next week's show, we'll talk about what was going on in some of these very ancient megalithic structures and also at Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe and these different places where among the Halal and the Ubaid people, they were burying themselves with little serpentine figures, the body of a man, but the face of a serpent. And so this seems to have been worldwide. Joe, when you were our filmographer in the Four Corners area of the United States, you remember we went into a traditional Hogan at the Navajo Nation and talked to Dr. Don Mose, one of the most highly respected Indian academics, still alive, writing books for their universities and so on. But he told us exactly the same story. And their creation mythos, above the mountain, a bright, shiny disc came down for you ufology people. But it came down out of the air. In it sat a bearded man, which is interesting because the Apache don't have facial hair, but they're describing what they're seeing, and it's more biblical than it actually was historically American Indian. But he creates all the good things on the earth. Then he goes away, but then soon after, the portal over the mountain opens again. And now a serpentine figure comes through. And immediately he's describing exactly this same thing that we're seeing worldwide, that then, of course, starts betraying the Indians, starts teaching them witchcraft. Remember him telling us
I do.
that? Now they're going down into their underground kivas. They
That's
start
right.
practicing cannibalism. So this was a phenomenon that has worldwide reporting, but it all goes back to this great serpentine figure we would call the fallen Lucifer, if you will, Satan, and what he did to take ownership of the earth and to spread this destruction and chaos worldwide. So it is biblical, but it's more than just biblical. We have the testament of this happening literally in every developed nation of the world going back to their beginning.
Now, there was a question that came to my mind when I researched the book, The Second Coming of Saturn, which you published, which also created kind of a theological war. I've been called a heretic for some of my conclusions. How can this entity be a serpent or serpentine and at the same time be a cherub, which is a human, lion, ox, eagle? And I think the answer is actually in the older Hebrew scriptures called the Septuagint. In Ezekiel 28, in the Septuagint translation, and this is the translation that was prepared by Jewish religious scholars in the 3rd century BC, taking older Hebrew texts that are no longer available to us and translating them into Greek, about 200 BC. This was what was available to the apostles. From the day you were created, I placed you with the cherub on the holy mountain of God. In other words, you're dealing with this entity, this serpentine entity who was placed in Eden with the cherub. And in verse 16, you sinned and were wounded from the mountain of God, and the cherub led you out of the middle of the fiery stones. In other words, there is no contradiction because this guardian cherub is a separate entity. He had to kick Lucifer out of Eden.
So, Derek, what do you make of the link between Satan, Lucifer, reptiles, and the serpentine?
Well, this is what got me called a heretic. In fact, this came up on another television program here recently. We were made aware of it. Somebody asked about the book, and it was dismissed as stupid because I concluded that Lucifer is not Satan, that it is the leader of the Watchers,
Oh, wow.
described in the book of 1 Enoch, that Shemiyaza, who is described as the chief of the Watchers, the sons of God from Genesis chapter 6, is the character identified in Scripture as Lucifer, which is a translation of the Hebrew, Hillel ben Shakar. A scholar named William R. Gallagher, about 30 years ago, wrote a paper and said that Hillel is actually the West Semitic, read Hebrew, transliteration of the Akkadian god Enlil, or Enlil, who was the creator god of Mesopotamia, whose temple, by the way, is where Ezekiel got his vision of the throne room of God, directly above the temple of Enlil, who was called Molech by the Hebrews, Saturn by the Romans, Kronos by the Greeks. But the bottom line here, either way, you've got a divine rebel who's being kicked out of Eden, and this character has clearly caused an inflection point in history where God was forced to step in and do something very drastic to get things back on track.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, so Donna, in the book, you and Tom have identified Lucifer as a serpentine king priest whose kingdom was and is earth. But a king has subjects too, so who do you say he was ruler over?
First, there is the obvious answer. 1/3 of the angels that fell with him. That's what a lot of scholars understand from what is being presented in Revelation 12, 3-4, who's, again, in Jude 6, their first estate wasn't good enough for them, and so they joined in the ultimate fate of the everlasting chains under darkness into judgment of the great day. So 1/3 of the angels that followed the Lucifer/Satan figure in the very beginning. I have heard a lot of scholars that have said, the 1/3 is misunderstood, but we did go ahead and continue moving forward with the idea that 1/3 is what we're looking at based on the mainstream with that. But secondly, a pre-Adamic race. Now, understand, I got to qualify this. The pre-Adamic race, when people hear pre-Adamites, or a pre-Adamic race, naturally everybody cringes. That's there for two reasons. First of all, there's this idea that, well, humans didn't exist before Adam. So when you say pre-Adamic race, are you talking about humans before Adam? Because obviously Adam was the first human and the Bible is clear. No, we're not talking about humans before the time of Adam, at least not the humans that would have been made in the image of God. Second of all, we are not talking about this very popular conspiracy theory that intergalactic space travelers at some point were more intelligent than us and they made Earth and then they made us and we all belong to the aliens and we have the aliens to thank for where we came from. These are the reasons why when most biblical scholars hear the question of a pre-Adamic race or pre-Adamites, they say there is no way that the Bible could ever allow for an interpretation where there would be a pre-Adamic race. No, I'm sorry. Take away the astronauts for a moment, and take away the idea that there was ever a human made in the image of God before Adam's time. The Bible actually forces the idea of a pre-Adamic race, and here's how. Angels were created before Adam. The Bible's clear about that, right? All angels were beings of extreme intelligence. The Bible is also clear about that. Let's go with the third for a moment. A third of them fell, becoming evil, and when they did, earth was their home. So there was a pre-Adamic race on earth before the time of Adam. Now, is there a possibility? Now, we know that Lucifer, or Satan, whatever you want to call him, we know that in Genesis 6, 1 through 4, there was this weird Nephilim story, right? Where he takes creation that God already made and he warps, genetically modifies through a DNA manipulation, a hybrid between human and angel. And what is born from that union is we can hardly even describe what that offspring is, but it does happen all throughout the Old Testament. We have these weird Nephilim and their offspring, and the Rephaim and the Anunnaki from the Sumerian. You know, we have all of these stories that go back to that moment. What if this deceiver, this Lucifer / Satan, wasn't just a manipulator of the human genome? What if he was also a manipulator of something else, something pre-Adamic? How old are dinosaurs? What if we're looking at the idea that there's a lot of things? Okay, you want to talk about Darwinian monkey men? Let's talk about Darwinian monkey men. What are they? They're clearly not human. That's not biblical that they would be human. But once in a while, somebody thinks they've found the genealogical link between monkey man and modern ape man, a bipedal human-looking like skeleton in the ground or something run alongside the dinosaurs. What is that if not human? A possibility is that it is a pre-Adamic race that is not human. Where did it come from?
And Donna, it's interesting that you're talking about this now because this article was published just very recently, the last few weeks. Remains found in China may belong to a third human lineage. And they literally, if you read the article, they're talking about a human hybrid. So it appears to have some kind of like hominid DNA, but it also has other things going on with it that absolutely are not human. And it doesn't even have a chin. In fact, Donna, its facial structure could even be thought of as being more reptilian than it is human because of the way the head is shaped. This thing, they've dated it to be 300,000 years old.
Oh, wow.
And it would definitely have been a pre-Adamite, but it does have some, when I say human-like features, I mean it has legs, it's bipedal, it's got arms, so it stood erect probably, it walked probably, but it is definitely not a human. And now this has the whole science community is just buzzing. So a team of paleontologists at the Chinese Academy of Sciences working with the University of York, the University of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, the National Research Center on Human Evolution, has found evidence of a previously unknown hybrid human lineage. In their study, reported now in the Journal of Human Evolution, the group analyzed the fossil jawbone, skull, leg bones, and so on, and dated it to 300,000 years old. So, some possible evidence of this very something like human that was on the earth a long time before Adam and Eve. And then in addition to that, Joe, like the Apocrypha, the ancient church fathers, the historians, the Dead Sea Scrolls, earth legends around the globe, speak of these mutated forms, or we would call them mutations, that were more monstrous, if you will, that predate Adam and Eve. For instance, Eusebius said this about the time on earth that you're talking about, this void era. He said there was all kinds of dragon-like monstrous beings. And then you go to Jubilees. By the way, there are people who believe that Jubilees should be part of the canon of Scripture. The Greek Orthodox Church, the Catholics, many include that in their Bible as Scripture. Jubilees 5:2, 7, 21, and 25 says, all flesh on earth corrupted its way, man and cattle and beasts and birds and everything which walks on the earth, and they began to eat one another. Now, the problem with this is nothing ate each other in God's original creation.
Right.
They
That's
were
right.
given the herbs of the field. So something happened that changed them. Furthermore, there are scientists who say there's evidence that the dinosaurs at one time were not carnivorous either. They were all herbivores. They ate plants and grass and that sort of thing. But then suddenly, scientists say, suddenly something happened. Sudden kind of chaos on the earth, and many of the dinosaurs then begin eating one another, which is exactly what this ancient book says happens. The Dead Sea Scrolls, Cave 4, describes a void-era fallen angel or a watcher called Malkarisha, who was, according to these scrolls, found in the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran, terrifyingly adder-like, like a poisonous viper. Then you have modern-day scholars like our late friend Dr. J.R. Church, who wrote in Prophecy in the News about the warped void era creatures who were, according to him, quote, designed with the DNA code of a reptilian race. So evidence global that this phenomenon did unfold.
Donna, last week we talked about the link between Lucifer, serpents, and reptiles, but dinosaurs were reptilian in nature, and if scientific dating is correct, they've been extinct since this void era that you keep talking about. Now, could Lucifer's fall be connected to the extinction of dinosaurs?
That is our theory. First of all, understand that etymologically speaking, that is the root of the word here. The Greek word dinos, fearfully or terribly great, and sauros, lizard. So putting that together, the word dinosaur comes from ancient Greek that means fearfully or great lizard. Now, here's the thing. No matter how old our human languages are, even ancient Greek is a very young, infantile language in the comparison to 66 million years. If that is even how old the bones are when we discover these bones of these creatures. But here's where we get into what is really strange about them. At one point, science says they were not fearfully or terribly great anything. As some of these scientific studies have shown, as they are quoted in the book, we actually have science itself attesting to the idea that dinosaurs were originally about the size of a German shepherd. And they may not have been carnivorous. You know, Tom mentioned that last week. They might have actually been an herbivore kind of creature from the very beginning. So we can't completely answer, did God create something else? And then Lucifer, being the DNA manipulator that we know him to be from the Genesis 6:4 narrative, did he take something that God originally designed and warp that? Maybe that's why we have, at some point in history, something changed. These German shepherd-sized lizards became big, ginormous, carnivorous savages. And of course, a lot of people want to come in at this early on in the conversation and they got to say, why do we not have them now? All right, why are they not still here? If God made them and they were as God designed them, why are they not here?
Yeah.
Noah took 2 of everything on the boat except for the clean animals that he took more of. He was instructed to take all animals 2 by 2. Did he whoops and forget the dinosaurs? We see that. It's kind of a running meme on those Christian t-shirts. They're hilarious, you know, the day that he forgot the unicorn and the dinosaurs. But the truth of the matter is some Christians will say, no, he remembered to take them. They were on the boat. But then, you know, Noah landed on Mount Ararat and the animals went out and the vegetation had changed on the earth. And or you know, there wasn't enough humans around for them to eat and live. So they just kind of went extinct. Well, again, with all due respect, whoops, God.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
you go through this whole planning session to make sure that what you have created is preserved, that it lives. And you didn't quite figure out how they were going to survive after they got off the boat? The truth of the matter is, if science, now we've been talking about whether or not science could even be right or wrong in its idea of 66 million years ago when the Chicxulub crater hit the earth, and that's what science believes happened to them. We've been talking about whether or not that particular timeline can even be accepted anyway. But assuming that it can, the era that the dinosaurs fell was the void era. They were not here 6 to 10,000 years ago when the flood would have happened anyway.
What's interesting is that, again, getting back to this idea that the science is not necessarily settled, is that over the last 25 years, it's now become acceptable for paleontologists to admit that they find things like blood vessels and soft tissue like collagen in the remains of these bones. Now, until the last 25 years, it was generally accepted that soft tissue, blood vessels could not be preserved even in permafrost more than a few thousand years. Now, suddenly, because they've been discovered and it's okay to talk about in that community, now we know somehow that you can preserve collagen for 65, 66 million years.
Even George Pember, who wrote Earth's Earliest Stages, went on to say, after commenting on Genesis 1:30, which is where we get, to every beast of the field and to every fowl of the air and to everything that creepeth upon the earth, meat was from the herbs. The herbs is what the meat was, right? So he goes on to say, there were therefore no carnivora in the sinless world. Since then, the fossil remains are those of creatures from before Adam's time, and yet they show evident tokens of disease, death. This is what we see in their bones. Disease, death, mutual destruction. So he concludes, they must have belonged to another world and have sin-stained history of their own, a history which ended in the ruin of themselves and their habitation. George Pember calls the fossils that come from this particular time the era of the fossils, the Luciferian void. So, two questions here. Were dinosaurs originally something that God created at all? Or are these big, hovering, stomping, savage beasts, man-eating beasts? Look at what Lucifer did in Genesis 6:1-4. Look at what his motive was. If he had effectively and successfully cut off the human line, the Messiah could never have been born.
Right.
If he could have done that back in the void era, made it so that humanity, when it came from Adam forward, made in the image of God, they could not have survived something like T-Rexes stomping around and eating everybody. His motive is central to this. So the question is, were dinosaurs originally made of God? And if so, were they the little German shepherd leaf eater thing?
Well, it's interesting, Donna, because my wife, Nita, is in the audience today, and she loves horses. She has miniature horses, right? Well, the ones from the void era, they were about the size of a gerbil.
Oh, my word.
So something definitely happened that changed in the animal kingdom, at least the evolutionary traits of those animals, if you want to put any stock in evolution. You mentioned the Chicxulub crater, that's underneath the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. And that's where many scientists do believe that this asteroid struck the Earth that wiped out 66 million years ago, the dinosaurs and all that. But my theory for some time has been, and you've seen headlines on SkyWatchTv.com, where if they have a story about the dinosaur asteroid, I always change it. Scientists confirm the dating of the fall of Lucifer. Why do I do that? It's because I believe that Lucifer was involved with, in fact, the text you were quoting earlier calls him a covering cherub. He was over something. He had administrative duties over a certain part of what the earth was before the fall. And then after the fall, general theory that he became what we today call Satan. Derek has a different opinion about that. But whatever this god of the earth is now that we call Satan, would have taken his dominion over some part of the earth as a covering cherub before the fall. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
And so there's a theory, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but it's called the Fifth Watcher. And it's original with Gary Stearman. I want to give him credit for that, but we'll talk about it. But anyway, that's what I think happened. It was not the Chicxulub asteroid. It could have been an asteroid that struck the earth, but what really wiped out the dinosaur kingdom was, I believe, that Lucifer was responsible for that species on the earth. And when he fell, his entire kingdom collapsed on earth and brought about the demise of the dinosaurs.
It could also be asked, was the Chicxulub asteroid and Lucifer the same thing?
The same thing.
Right.
When Jesus
was
says,
the
I saw
asteroid.
him fall like lightning, was he the asteroid? And it's interesting, too, because Chicxulub, that's Mayan, and it means the devil's tail.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, wow.
don't forget too that science acknowledges that when the Chicxulub asteroid hit the Earth, now it actually brought to extinction not only the dinosaurs, but a large number of marine reptiles. And that gets into some weird waters because you're looking at Lucifer and you're looking at Leviathan, which I can't wait to get into, and you're looking at, the sea creatures and how do they interact. You've got all of these lizards of the water.
Well, and Derek and Dr. Heiser both have written extensively, I think, that you might be talking about a judgment on the chaos dragon.
Right.
And in his lifetime, Derek talked about this. It's beautiful imagery. Talks about when Jesus walked upon the waters, he was actually showing his dominion over the chaos dragons of the sea.
No.
Yeah.
That's what he was doing. They are under my feet. They are under my authority.
Donna, you mentioned Leviathan. Let's get right into that. Some scholars believe that the strange character called Leviathan in the Bible is actually a dinosaur. But the Bible calls it both a dragon and a serpent. So does he play a role into all of this somehow as well?
As a literary device, a lot of scholars see that Leviathan is a personification of chaos. So it's kind of like when you're reading through Proverbs and other areas of the Old Testament, you get that personification like Lady Wisdom in Proverbs 8. It's not an actual person whose name is Lady Wisdom. It's a personification of an idea. Some scholars think that Leviathan is just a personification of a standard idea, a concept, chaos being the concept. Okay, I don't believe that, but I will say that even if that's all it is, Leviathan's name literally represents the state of chaos. Leviathan existed in a time in Earth's history that was prior to the fall of man, possibly prior to the fall of Lucifer. So this thing, Leviathan, whatever it is, this sea serpent, it is absolutely the chaos of the original Earth. Now, of course, a lot of scholars will also compare when you're looking at Lucifer and you're looking at Satan and all of these weird serpentine, snaky, imagery. When you look at all of that, that's also embodied in Leviathan. So that would explain why some, and I realize I can't wait to hear what Derek has to say about all of this, because some scholars do actually link Leviathan, Lucifer, Satan, and chaos all together. If that's how we are to view this, that's very interesting because now you have a link to the original void era of Earth, the tohu vabohu, the without form and void judgment era of our planet's history, linking not only to Lucifer and to Satan's fall, but also literally linked to this sea serpent god of chaos. When we talked about it a couple of weeks ago. What do tohu vabohu mean? An uninhabitable wasteland of chaos.
Yeah.
So no, Leviathan wasn't a dinosaur.
Derek, it's not hard to see the links between Satan, Lucifer, Leviathan, dragons, and serpents, but you believe Leviathan had a lot more to do with the deep mentioned in Genesis 1:2. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that we wrote in our book, Sharon and me, Giants, Gods, and Dragons, to try to make the point for people who are looking at the Bible and saying, there's all these weird things in here, I can't believe the Bible. No, God calls these characters in the Bible giants, gods, and dragons. And of course, one of the most prominent is Leviathan. In Genesis 1, verse 2, as we discussed in the previous program, the earth was without or became formless and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. Well, the word translated deep in Hebrew is tahom. Now, that is a cognate, which means same word, different language, with the Akkadian word temtum, which in turn is a cognate for the Sumerian word Tiamat. Tiamat was the Sumerian name of their multi-headed chaos monster, chaos dragon that had to be subdued by a warrior god in Mesopotamian religion. Depending on when the story was written, it was either the sky god Anu, it was the creator god Enlil, it was the storm god Marduk. Again, depending on when it was written, the hero changed from time to time. But this story is consistent in the ancient world, and it always involves a warrior god having to subdue chaos in order to create a world fit for humanity. The main difference, and this even extends into the Egyptian and the Greek religion, where Zeus had to subdue Typhon. The bottom line is this: in all of those stories, the warrior god had to have assistance, like another god come help him, or magic weapons. Baal, when he defeated the sea god or the chaos dragon called Yam, had these magic clubs that were given to him. in the Bible, we get the story where God just subdues it right here. Genesis 1, verse 2. Darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. That's it. It's like Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, just said, down, stay.
Yeah.
And that's it. Now, we see a day coming in Isaiah 27, verse 1, where God will eventually, in that day, destroy the twisting serpent, the fleeing serpent, which, by the way, is a direct quote from the Canaanite Baal cycle. And that day, I believe, is reflected in Revelation chapter 27, verse 1, the final chapter of the Bible, where there's a new heaven and a new earth, and the sea is no more. The sea being a symbol of primordial chaos. As Tom mentioned before the break, Jesus walking across the Sea of Galilee, subduing the storm. Not only subduing chaos, but subduing the storm god, Baal, who Jesus identified as Satan, getting Satan and chaos at the same time. I believe that we're dealing with serpentine entities who've rebelled against God. Now, I think that Lucifer, or Shemayaza, Enlil, Saturn, Kronos, Leviathan, Chaos, and Satan are three separate entities reflecting three separate rebellions. Chaos, Genesis 1, Eden, Genesis 3, that would be Satan, and then Genesis 6, Shemayaza, or Lucifer, if you will. But the bottom line is this: these entities with a serpentine appearance, a radiant serpentine appearance, have rebelled against their creator. And I think that's reflected in the serpent worship that we see in the ancient world all throughout the Holy Land and at places like Göbekli Tepe.
But you don't think Leviathan is only relevant to the past. You actually personally believe that he is somehow relevant to the future, and maybe even the spirit of Antichrist?
We made this case in that book and also in our ongoing series, Unraveling Revelation. We believe that the beast that emerges from the sea in Revelation 13 is this multi-headed chimera. That's exactly how dragons, and specifically the chaos monster, was depicted in ancient Mesopotamia. And so we think that the spirit that will inhabit the human that we call Antichrist in the end times is the spirit of chaos, the spirit of Leviathan. We look at what's happening on our streets around the world today. What else would you call it but chaos?
Right.
Even though he's not and destroyed, and he and his minions, these demonic minions, are still influencing the world today.
Well, and then Jesus gave power to his disciples. He sends them out. They come back amazed that even the demons are subject to them by his name. And from the first era of the church until today, the subduing of these forces that are always wanting to pierce into this reality, to damage mankind again, they've been suppressed. But now, as the world and the church is turning to heresy, apostasy. People are not going to church anymore. People don't believe in God anymore. All of that's happening, and look what's happening. Chaos is developing all around the world. This, at its core, is a supernatural warfare.
It is. And, you know, there's even a callback to an earlier program on SkyWatch TV with Rudy Landa and Doug Van Dorn, the author of Giants, Sons of the Gods, the Angels and Watchers docuseries. That was focusing on the megalithic structures in the ancient kingdom of Bashan, where Og of Bashan was the ruler, the last of the remnant of the Rephaim. His kingdom was the first military objective given to Moses by God. And that name, Bashan, literally means place of the serpent. That was the name of the Akkadian chaos dragon, the seven-headed dragon depicted in an ancient inscription dated to about 2600 BC, showing the war god Ninurta defeating Bashmu, Bashan, the chaos serpent. And interestingly, one of the heads appears to have suffered a mortal wound, just as prophesied in the book of Revelation. And think about that. As much time passed between that little inscription, this little depiction of this battle between a warrior god and chaos, and Jesus walking the earth, as between Nebuchadnezzar destroying the temple in Jerusalem and us having this conversation.
Yeah.
This is a very, very old battle, but the Bible contains the true record of this history.
This is one of the reasons that I'm saying everybody's got to get this book. There is so much about the history of the world and its connection to the Hebrew Bible, the arrival of Jesus Christ, and of course there's a lot more if you go into Mount Hermon and all of that. He continues to illustrate his power. He goes from there, he's crucified, he goes down into the lower regions of the earth, and he says, "I'm here, boys, and you can't do nothing about it." So the Bible is a testament of what did happen, and some people believe, by the way, that the Tohu, the void era, might not have even been the first time. There could have been one before that.
Oh, yeah, I've heard
And then
that.
Lucifer comes down and he starts it all over again. And then what happens? You get to the New Testament, God recreates everything, and here he is again. They're descending on Mount Hermon. They're coming in to genetically manipulate the human race like they did with the dinosaur era and all that. It just happens over and over and over. But the good news is it is coming to an end.
Yeah.
Because Jesus
Yeah.
Christ is about to return to this planet, and he's going to
Yep.
mop clock with the rest of these entities.
Yeah.
I love it.
That description you just gave too reminded me of the song Carmen did, The Champion.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
and
yeah.
when the demons and stuff are fighting and Jesus is fighting Satan and they're going after it, and then Jesus goes down for the count, but then God counts.
Right.
10,
Yes, he does.
9,
Shivers,
8,
yeah.
7, and it
Yep.
goes. It's
That's
just
great, yeah.
incredible song. I love that song.
Well, the Bible's just so much more entertaining than fiction.
Oh,
Like any movie you go watch, you don't know who you should root for or whatever. We know we can root in Jesus, and that at the
Yes.
end we win.
That's right.
Amen.
Wins, he conquers the world.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I want to follow up with Derek for just a half second here and really highlight what lies beneath, because this was a DVD that you produced with Dr. Aaron Judkins on this subject, and it complements the Before Genesis book so perfectly.
Yeah, he's got a book that he's written and researched with our good friend Dr. Judd Burton on Göbekli Tepe, and the fact that this is what archaeologists call the world's oldest temple. It is a huge site in southern Turkey. They're finding now that there are 11 other sites near it on hills, all with similar iconography, and they all were created apparently as specifically religious sites, not dwellings, not communities, but places to go and worship. And iconography of serpents is all over these T-shaped pillars that are found at all of these locations. So what was being worshiped there, if we're dealing with these serpentine entities that we believe we're talking about, the Nakash, the Seraphim, these are perhaps the entities that were worshipped at Göbekli Tepe, at Karahan Tepe, at similar sites in southern Turkey. He talks about the apparent the veneration of human skulls that was taking place there. I mean, this is one of the sites nearby actually has a building that they call the Skull Temple because it was apparently where the heads were removed and then were used in this cult. It was not a nice place, and yet this and the age of it suggests that humans in that place and in that time were venerating these very spirits. And we go into that in that discussion.
Minutes to do it. The links you've observed between Lucifer, his role as cherub, and the serpent in the garden have led you to develop an astounding theory called the fifth watcher. What is all of this about?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me correct or whatever, but let me give credit where credit is due. Actually, Gary Stearman came up with
Okay.
this novel theory called the Fifth Watcher. I'm visiting with him one day. We're talking about the book of Revelation. You have these four cherub, and they're very strange, and we'll talk about that in a moment, in heaven. And Gary says, yeah, but that doesn't include, whatever we were talking about, but that doesn't include the fifth watcher. And I said, what? The fifth watcher? Give me my Bible. Where's the fifth watcher? I don't see him up there at the throne of God. And he said, but I think that before the fall, he said, I think Lucifer was a fifth watcher. First of all, he is called a covering cherub in the same kind of language as the four cherub are referred to. He was a very powerful angelic being, and he is described as having reptilian features. Now, here's what Gary pointed out to me. He said, note this about the cherub that are mentioned in the book of Revelation 4, 6 through 11. You have one cherub that has the face of a man, which we would think this cherub is a covering cherub. He has a responsibility for overseeing the welfare of humankind. He's got the face of a man. Now you've got a second one that's got the face of a lion. He said this would be the wild, undomesticated animals of the lands, the forests and the fields. This cherub has some responsibility for overseeing them. Then you have a third watcher that has the face of an ox, and this would represent domestic animals that can be made to serve humanity. They can be domesticated.
Right.
And then you have this fourth watcher that has the face of an eagle. So this represents represents the animals that have capacity for flight or that are in the air. But where is a watcher that represents the reptilian species that is on the
Right.
earth? And furthermore, even before that, what watcher would have been overseeing the dinosaurs, the great
Right.
reptilians that are on the earth, if in fact it follows the same pattern? So he said, I think before the fall, he was the fifth watcher in heaven. He had the responsibility for overseeing the dinosaurs and other reptilians and also life in the sea, which are also not represented by these four
Yeah.
cherub. But when he was kicked out of heaven, he became the Chicxulub asteroid per se, right? Struck the earth, impacted the earth, but his kingdom, the dominion over which he was given authority, all fell with him at the same time. And that's why you saw these chaotic changes of the dinosaurs going from being herbivores to now they're meat eaters. So in this tohu, void period of time, that's when the fifth watcher lost his dominion in heaven. And like Donna pointed out last week, Jesus refers to him as falling from the heavens like lightning, and he impacted the earth.
And don't forget, too, that the Chicxulub asteroid that you're talking about took out a great number and permanently extinct in one day a large number of marine reptiles.
Marine reptiles, and we're talking about something like 75 to 80% of all life on Earth at that time was made extinct. So this was phenomenal. One other thing I would say, Derek, this DVD that we are providing with the book, you recently interviewed Dr. Judson. You guys made an interesting point. So I'm listening to this. You said something that jumped out at me, and you said, note that these four cherub that are mentioned in the book of Revelation chapter 4 align with the four cardinal points of the Babylonian astronomical sky, right? What is the significance of that?
That's the question, isn't it? And this is something we got from the late Dr. Michael Heiser. But when you got the face of the man, the eagle, the ox, and the lion, you basically are looking at north, south, east, west in the Babylonian astronomical sky. And I don't think it's coincidental that those are also the four faces of the cherubim, the four faces of the pagan representation of the cherubim, the Lamassu found at Nineveh, the ancient Assyrian kingdom. So I think it's an acknowledgement that this entity that guarded the very throne of God with the four faces also represented the heavenly host, the heavenly army, as it were, the angels of God.
And the north, south, east, and west, there's a bit of a redundancy in the scriptures. I will call forth my angels from the four corners of the earth. That's kind of an ancient thinking, but it represents everything that is on this planet is being covered or maybe even polluted but by these forces. And a long time ago, I wrote a book that's out of print called The Gods Who Walk Among Us, and I introduced a novel idea that had come to me, and that was that why you often see in comparative religion studies, they'll say, well, the Bible's just borrowing from these other pagan cultures and what they believed, and so much of the Bible is just being ripped off. But my thought was, no, when God created Adam and Eve 6,500 years ago, there was an original revelation. He gave them knowledge and power, maybe even prophetically speaking, and then at the fall, everything became splintered. But these ideas were out there now with their kids, with their grandkids, and they got kind of drawn into the pagan cultures. So they just started repeating something from the original revelation of God. This might be what the Babylonians were doing, was they're actually borrowing from a revelation that God had given to Adam.
And a revelation that had been twisted into sort of a fake news version by the principalities and powers. God created the fallen realm, or the spirit realm, the angelic realm, if you will, with free will, just as he did with mankind. And just like humanity, many of these angels chose badly.
Now, are you saying, Derek, that the Babylonians were the first CNN and MSNBC?
We'll let the viewers decide that. Yeah.
Donna, there are historical artifacts and archaeological sites all over the world that silently testify of an intelligence on Earth. Yet, if scientific dating methods are actually reliable, these findings would predate Adam, would they not?
Right. So in our book, we took and looked at three different possibilities here. The first possibility is that the dating methods are off because scientists make mistakes, or they're trying to cover up a conspiracy, or whatever the thing, they're hiding the truth, whatever the reason, The first possibility is that the sites are not actually as old as science believes that they are, and that a mistake has been made there. Possibility number 2 is that Adam and his descendants were actually brought into the picture much earlier than we understand them to be. The time of Adam is much longer ago than 6 to 10,000 years old, and that is equally a possibility here, in which case, if that is the case, then these old sites belong to Adam's descendants, or possibly descendants of the Nephilim, of the giants and the great men of renown of old that Genesis 6, 1 through 4 mention as well. The third possibility, and this is the possibility that Tom and I took in the book, not because it's the most likely possibility, but because this is the way to respond to the mainstream voice out there, which is predominantly young Earth. And it is that something or something else was here before Adam. And so a pre-Adamic race, be it fallen angel, be it something else, be it monkey men that we seem to keep on clinging to in our science textbooks, whatever it was, something was on Earth prior to the time of Adam.
So Donna, in a lot of my historical research, we've seen relics like old things that look like a computer, or the Anunnaki in ancient Sumeria wearing things that look like a watch. What kind of relics and intelligence do these old sites display?
Well, actually, so the intelligence is actually so advanced that we don't have, a lot of these things are called out-of-place artifacts. OOPARTs for short. And that's another one of those terms. The minute somebody says OOPART, the archaeologists and the scientists all run into a hole and go, oh, I'm so embarrassed. I can't believe we're still talking about OOPARTs. The reason for that is because oftentimes, because we can't explain them, the ancient astronaut theorists come out and they say aliens, 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 aliens. And that's part of the reason why when you hear OOPARTs, everybody cringes and shrinks. But to just give you a couple of examples here, one of the OOPARTs we cannot explain as the Gate of the Sun in the site of Tiahuanaco. Now, Tiahuanaco, the whole site is astounding. But specifically of the Gate of the Sun, this was carved from a single monolithic stone, itself weighing 20,000 pounds, and it was transported from a quarry 10 miles away over land and sea. If you look at what the Tiahuanacans did, how they lived, what they did, they lived in little reed boats when they were on the water. So how do you transport 20,000 pounds in a single stone in a little reed boat across the water? You don't. That's the thing. And then the mystery. Some archaeologists, of course, date this particular stone to be between 12 to 14,000 years old. And that is in part, that dating comes from its astroarchaeological nature. And what that means is astroarchaeology is the study of understanding the ancients and how they studied the sky and what they understood about the sky. And what they understand about the sky in this particular case cannot be explained. First of all, it features a round Earth, not a flat Earth that is understood to be like the predominant explanation of what the shape of the Earth was in ancient thought and concept. Second of all, it details astrological phenomena in relation to equinoxes and solstices, like what on earth, right? It's got the latitudinal position of the civilization as it would have appeared on a GPS system at the time, precisely. It's got the obliquity of the ecliptic or the axial tilt. What that basically means is the alignment of the angles between Earth's rotational axis and its orbital axis. How did they know these things?
Right.
What in the world? It goes on to talk about complex mathematics. This is all on one gate. This is one artifact I'm talking about. Complex mathematics, including the proper ratio of pi, square roots, degree angles, and their practical trigonometrical uses in construction and astronomy. And then, of course, the deity at the top of the gate is Viracocha, also Quetzalcoatl. And this is the sea-traveling serpent god who created the sun, the moon, the stars, and giants.
Yeah.
What on earth? So all of this has come. Now listen, it's not just the gate here. This gate and the rest of Tiahuanaco is in a site that is just barely under 13,000 level elevation, which means that any human living there for longer than 2 or 3 days would hyperventilate and die. So you've got a whole bunch of these early humans that have this all figured out. They know everything that's going on, everything that I've just said, they comprehend it. It's a miracle, transporting 20,000 pounds in a reed boat 10 miles over land and sea. And then at the end of the day, they're doing all of this while hyperventilating to death, and they can't even last long enough to procreate.
Right.
Really. So in the middle of all of this, Tiahuanaco, according to where they can trace from its beginning to its end, they know that this site was inhabited for at least half a century. How? This is what I'm saying. This is just one artifact, one part. This goes on and on and on and on. And there's a lot that can be said about some of these other places, but that's just one example.
Well, Donna, Tiahuanaco is just one tip of the iceberg, as you've just mentioned. I mean, I've heard so much about another site, and we've been talking about this place called Göbekli Tepe. It's on the cover of the DVD. I mean, you're going to learn about this very soon, what archaeologists believe to be the Earth's oldest ruins. But besides intelligence, some of your research has uncovered a religious nature as well, right?
Yes, actually, and of course, Derek will be able to weigh in on a lot of this, but just to give you a really quick bullet point rundown here. Now, only 5% of the site has been excavated as of yet, but that we know of, there is no evidence anywhere close that a settlement was ever nearby. They didn't have any place to be fed and housed while all of these workers constructed this ancient site that we understand, this religious city. The oldest layer is pre-pottery Neolithic, which means, of course, it dates us back to the time that human beings were, if we were there at all, we couldn't construct a clay pot, right? Okay. That's
Right.
what we're looking at, somewhere in the ballpark of 10,000 to 6,500 BC. Nobody knows who constructed Göbekli Tepe. There are many theories, but nobody knows for sure. Meanwhile, there are these T-shaped pillars everywhere at the site, and they are up to 20 feet high and 40,000 pounds each. Up to, so several of them are smaller. And serpents are everywhere. Serpents are everywhere in this site. In fact, I've got a quote here. The archaeologists say that some of these places depict, and I quote, groups of male snakes pursuing a female with the intention of mating. Genesis 6:1-4, anyone? Archaeologists also report in the Snakes of Göbekli Tepe an ethological consideration. That's the name of the article here. They say the animal most frequently depicted is the snake, most likely the Macrovipera labitina, the venomous blunt-nosed viper, which is evidence for a biblical theology that featured supernatural watchers, a term for the fallen angels of Luciferian origin. This is secular archaeologists that are saying this is what is being depicted in Göbekli Tepe. They're not trying to prove the Bible. Half of them don't even believe in it. And then, of course, Klaus Schmidt, which everybody in the archaeology world knows that he is like the expert excavator, the original guy here. He says that this site was absolutely not, under no circumstances, built by ragged bands of hunter-gatherers, and that the hundreds of thousands of pounds of carved stones dedicated to the serpents would have required, and I quote, hundreds of workers all needing to be fed and housed. How, when there's no settlement nearby?
Right. Now, Derek, you recently interviewed Dr. Aaron Judkins, who is an expert, by the way, on the Göbekli Tepe site. What were some of the conclusions that he had come to? And I believe that many of those are in this DVD that is available with this offer, correct?
Right, yeah. He's written a book called Guardians of Göbekli, and his theory, and he's worked with our friend Dr. Judd Burton on this as well, is that this was an evidence of watcher worship, which is interesting that they reached the same conclusion as the secular researchers. Now, obviously, they're approaching this from a Christian worldview, but the imagery of the serpents that are so prominent on so many of those T-shaped pillars, which are generally believed to represent the human torso, is just really stunning. And some of them, there are so many serpents that it looks like he's wearing like a shirt, like almost a male shirt made up of these crisscrossing serpents across the back of the T. As Donna mentioned, this is really phenomenal that you're in an era that not only is pre-pottery, it's before the wheel. So you're moving these massive pieces of stone without the use of a wheel. Forget about using a cart. You're basically having to drag these pieces of stone. Were there settlements nearby? We know that the closest water source to what's been excavated is about 3 miles away, which means that as you're digging in the sun of southern Anatolia in the summertime to excavate these things, you've got to be hauling water for miles for the workforce. You would assume that the workforce would have to walk to the job site, clock in sort of like Fred Flintstone back in the day, and begin your workday. Now, again, with 95% of the site not yet excavated, it's possible that they will uncover dwellings. But the fact that what they found so far is so clearly focused on a religious aspect that is absolutely astonishing. And this is why you've got such attention being paid to it and so many theories that range from, well, again, secular archaeologists say, yeah, this is clearly a religious site, to some that are just really way out there, dealing with, sky gods or whatever. From a Christian perspective, looking at this as a place of veneration of the small g gods who once walked the earth, I think that is probably closest to the accurate description of what's found at this site. And what is really astonishing is that the Turkish archaeologists have discovered 11 other sites nearby, Karahan Tepe, which is probably even older, and 10 others that are in that vicinity. They call them Tas Tepele, which means the stone hills, because these T-shaped pillars are a constant theme. And so now that begs the question, why there? What was it about that area? And isn't it interesting that it was from that very location, Haran, nearby, where God called Abraham, and from him, eventually, Isaac, Jacob, and eventually the Messiah?
Yeah, in fact, what's interesting is that there are secular researchers that argue that that area right there, Göbekli Tepe specifically, might have been the location for the Garden of Eden because of the way the rivers around it come together that are described in the Bible. There's others that say the oral traditions about Göbekli Tepe were actually carried into the land of Canaan by the first Israelites so that they would have had some knowledge of it. So there's just stuff there that you could hardly wait for them to excavate it, but then should we? Because if it was built, built by the Watchers,
Wow.
there's this possibility that there's knowledge that was buried there to preserve it after the flood.
Well, and you used the right word, buried, and that's the thing that is really stunning when you see the size of the site. And again, understanding that what's excavated, which is already a pretty big site, UNESCO or the United Nations has designated it a UNESCO World Heritage Site for good reason. We should learn from it, but what is not understood is why it was buried.
After so much
Intentionally.
work,
It was
and
intentionally
appears that they rushed
buried.
to bury it.
Right.
Intentionally backfilled.
Right. Now, when I've talked to Aaron Judkins and also privately with Dr. Judd Burton about it, their belief is that perhaps those who built the site realized that those that they had been venerating, these supernatural entities, weren't the good guys. They don't actually have our best interests in mind, and suddenly they decided to cover it all up and bury it. Now, there are other sites in the ancient Near East, such as near Gilgal Rephaim, where similarly, religious sites have been ritually buried and then abandoned. But why there? Why such a big site? And again, if this is just one of a collection of a dozen or more sites, what was going on there, and who were these serpentine entities that were worshipped?
Now, there's another theory, because I think Dr. Judkins believes that Göbekli Tepe was built following the Great Flood, but there's others who argue that it was built before the Great Flood, and that there was knowledge built into the structures there, the religious community, that the Watchers wanted to be preserved so that it could be discovered and survive the Great Flood. That's a theory that's among a lot of people. Now, just one quick thing. In the book of Jubilees, there's a pattern for this kind of an idea where it says, Jubilees chapter 8, that, and I'll do this quick, in the 29th Jubilee in the first week, in the beginning thereof, Arpachshad took to himself a wife named Rasuajah, and the daughter of Susan, the daughter of Elam, and the bare a son. The third week, anyway, it's a kid named Canaan is born. And you go down through but then it says this. It says, the son grew, and his father taught him writing, and he went to seek for himself a place where he might seize for himself a city. And he found a writing which former generations had carved into the rock. This is right after the flood. Carved into the rock. He transcribed it and sinned against owing it, for it contained the teachings of the Watchers. And so this was something that had been created before the flood, like an intentional effort to preserve some knowledge, mysticism, magic, whatever, of the Watchers. This is in the book of Jubilees, which again, some believe should be in the canon and is in the Bible of like the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox and so on. So there's, whether it's scripture or not, it's an ancient book, and it provides this pattern that there was an effort to preserve the knowledge of the Watchers. So this is why I think some people believe that Göbekli Tepe might have something there that, like you say, once we uncover it, we might wish we wouldn't have.
And we're only in it, Tiahuanaco, Göbekli Tepe.
Right.
Like there's so much more.
And in the book, before Genesis, there's a lot more illustrations, a lot more of this kind of information. Your library, whether you are a Christian or not a Christian, your library is not complete. Now, I'm not just pitching a book. I'm telling you, this is my favorite book ever published by Defender Publishing. It's amazing, it's unprecedented, and it accomplishes something that no other book on this subject ever has.
System, you must go back. As we wrap up today, Donna, I mentioned at the onset of the program Göbekli Tepe. And of course, you know that Göbekli Tepe is associated to Karahan Tepe. Archaeologists call them sister cities. Okay? Does Karahan Tepe also feature serpents or serpent worship in its architecture?
Yes, in fact, it does. First of all, Karahan Tepe and Göbekli Tepe are sister sites. That's what the archaeologists are saying. Part of that is because of the similarities in the T structures and just the way that the sites were built and everything else. But part of it is their religious association. First of all, understand that archaeologists are surmising at this point that Karahan Tepe is at least 1,000 years older than Göbekli Tepe. So Göbekli Tepe is actually the oldest confirmed set of ruins on planet Earth. Karahan Tepe, they are suggesting right now, and we will probably know very soon in the future, that Karahan Tepe is quite a bit older. It's only 1% excavated at present, but from what we understand at this point, serpents, again, are everywhere. Serpent artifacts, serpent carvings, religious iconography, it's everywhere. But in as little as they've excavated up to this point, there's one particular room, they call it the phallus room, which is a very ritualistic religious room, is very, very strange in structure AB. And what we see is 11 stone phalluses kind of growing up from the floor. They're carved out of stone and they're approximately 6 feet tall. At one point on the wall, in an astrological alignment, so that when the sun rises, it shines directly on this being's face, we have a half man, half snake, bearded being that is slithering out of the wall and looking over these phalluses. So he's kind of watching over them or something weird, right? The experts that have weighed in on who this person might be, this is very telling. They say that this is the god known as Enki, a serpentine Nephilim god that is also, get this, the god of water. So over and over and over again, we see these Genesis 6:1-4 icons coming into play where there's giants involved and there's serpents everywhere, water, Leviathan, chaos. While we're on the subject of these ancient sites, let me just throw a few words about Baalbek in there. The largest confirmed ancient stone block on Earth comes from Baalbek. And although Baalbek is not necessarily known for its serpentine iconography all throughout the site, there are things that are just nuts about this place. The largest stone on Earth, confirmed for the purposes of building and construction, is 64 feet long, 19.6 feet wide, 18 feet high. And like I said a few weeks back, it weighs an estimated 3.3 million pounds.
Wow.
It likely dates to the same era as the pottery fragments that are located in the channel below what is called the Roman Temple of Jupiter. So it predates Roman habitation and ingenuity by far. We're looking at something that is around 8,000 years old, very likely. Now, this particular stone required an estimated 40,000 laborers to move it. But regardless of the number of laborers, this is when we get into questions like this. How? Regardless of the number of people, how was a 3.3 million pound stone moved in one piece from a quarry mile away?
Well, and how was it even cut out of solid rock into one single biggest rock in the world and then moved into that place? The precision of those stones is astonishing.
Well, and we couldn't even do that nowadays. in a
I don't
mine.
know that we have anything that could move it. How did
Yeah.
and so you got a bunch of guys that are milking camels out in the desert. How in the world did they move that stone? What's your theory, Derek?
Well, I honestly don't know, other than a lot of engineering, and perhaps they were better engineers than we give them credit for thousands of years ago. But I'm curious about that location because, as we know, the Romans built a temple of Jupiter on top of the ancient temple to Baal or Baal, who Jesus identified as Satan. This was the largest temple to Jupiter in the Roman Empire. Now, why would the temple to the chief god of the Romans not be in, Rome instead of there?
Right.
What was there about that location? And I've speculated before, Sharon and I, that rift, that Dead Sea transform, which is a fault line that runs from the Red Sea in the south all the way up to Turkey through the Bekaa Valley, where Baalbek is located, is perhaps supernaturally charged. Mount Hermon is along that line. The Sea of Galilee, where Jesus walked across the water, where he sent the demons into the herd of swine, went into the water there. Jerusalem's just a few miles to the west. You've got Mount Sinai not far from there, depending on where you put it on your map. But Moses, Mount Nebo to the just east of there, Jericho, Sodom, all along that line. Something supernatural about that particular location. And when you extend that up into Turkey, then you're getting up very near this area here where you've got Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, Haran, where Abraham was called from. Something about that region, in fact, in my book, The Second Coming of Saturn, the ancient city called Urkesh, where Saturn's Hurrian forebear called Kumarbi was worshipped, all in that region. And you could just draw a line on a map and just, what is it? Is that maybe a scar from where one or another of these fallen entities was cast down from the mountain of God?
And something happened there, because when the Romans discovered Baalbek, many of those gigantic stones, they were strewn about, buried in the sand. They're only now uncovering some of the biggest ones in the world too. And then the Romans came in and they built their temple to Zeus on the top of it.
Right.
And you can clearly see the demarcation between the Romans, who could move fairly large, massive stones. They built devices to be able to do it.
Yeah,
and
they're capstans.
Theirs look like somebody came along with a wheelbarrow full of bricks and laid them down on the top of what was there before. I mean, who built that?
Right.
Was it the flood that destroyed it? I mean, what happened there?
Yeah. That area in what we call the ancient Near East, which includes the area that became Israel, is supernaturally charged. And the ancient Near East would include everything over to as far as like Western Iran, so Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Syria, Jordan, all of that area where biblical history took place, going back to the time of Noah, as far north as Armenia. That part of the earth has got something supernatural connected to it. And that's that region that Donna and you have written about in the book here, Karahan Tepe, Göbekli Tepe. As you were talking about Karahan Tepe, again, we're talking about the pre-pottery era, before the invention of the wheel. And yet there was a civilization that was so advanced that they were constructing these religious sites with massive stones at a time when you would think they'd spend most of their time trying to, hunt or gather or something.
Survive.
Instead, just survive.
Yeah.
But scholars who've looked at these sites, in particular Karahan Tepe, as you said, Donna, just 1% excavated, described the site as stupefyingly big.
Yeah.
Why devote this much energy to this kind of a religious site? And just within the last few years, because it's only been discovered within the last within the last year, researchers noticed, hey, it's on the winter solstice, when the sun rises on the winter solstice, that it shines right on the snake man's head, possibly a representation of the ancient Sumerian god Enki, whose temple in Eridu, which is in southeastern Iraq, is where we believe the Tower of Babel was located, located directly above the great underground aquifer called the Abzu, or the Abyss. But that concept originated not there in ancient Sumer, it originated further north in the region around Göbekli Tepe, the region of the ancient biblical Horites, or the Hurrian people, who brought this idea that somehow we had got to communicate with gods in the netherworld who are on the other side of a body of water. This idea brought into the modern era as the idea of crossing over Jordan or crossing the river Styx. This is a very, very ancient concept, and we're seeing it depicted, and this idea is coming out as they dig the stones away from these places that were ritually buried. Karahan Tepe, Göbekli Tepe. I mean, 2,000 years ago, Jesus said, okay, you can stop me and my followers talking, but then the stones would cry out. Thank God for archaeologists, because of their work, the stones are literally crying out. One of the most astonishing things that's come out of the research at Karahan Tepe is what the researchers call a surprising number of people depicted with 6 fingers on each hand. And they don't know what to make of it because, of course, they're looking at it from a secular perspective and not from a biblical worldview. We read in the Bible of, in David's day, giants that had to be taken down, or a giant that had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. But we see this at Karahan Tepe, where the majority of the human figures depicted on the carvings there have 6 fingers. And what really astonished us is we were doing some research, again, getting back to this idea of the fault line, the Dead Sea transform transformed that runs right through the lands of the Bible. You know, the Jordan River runs right on top of this fault line, is a site very near ancient Sodom, just at the north end of the Dead Sea, called Telalat al-Gasul. This is in the Chalcolithic, so we're talking probably 6,000 years after the time of Karahan-Tepe, around 5,000 to 4,000 BC. Civilization, little gathering place in the Copper Age, north end of the Dead Sea. They found a painting, a wall painting, that was somehow survived the last 6,000 years. They had to use a computer program to reconstruct the paint flakes, but it appears to depict a religious procession led by a figure who's much larger than those who are following him, and this character is carrying a flail in his right hand, which is a symbol of power and authority, and on that hand is 6 fingers. Now again, is this coincidental?
Wow.
If I was a coincidence theorist, I'd say, yeah, just a coincidence, nothing to see here, citizen, move along. But it's very interesting that this is located in the valley just below the site where archaeologists have determined that the site of ancient Sodom was destroyed just a couple of thousand years after that. So what was going on along this rift line from Turkey all the way down through the Holy Land, down to the Red Sea, we don't know, but we can put together some theories, and I think the timeline of history, the narrative contained in the Bible, I think is an accurate representation of what happened.
I want to hit the ground running, Tom, with just a few minutes left on the clock. We've been talking about all these old sites around the world and how they silently testify to an incredible ancient intelligence, alive and well on Earth's surface from long ago. But more importantly, does the Bible actually say anything about all of these ruins?
Yeah, I actually believe that it does. For instance, in Jeremiah, Jeremiah 4:23 through 27 says, quote, I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form. Now, wait a minute. This same terminology here, many scholars say this really ought to be translated, it became. So it's in support of what the other text we quoted in the first 2 weeks. I beheld the earth, and lo, it became without form and void, tohu and bohu. And all the cities thereof were broken down at the presence of the Lord, and by his fierce anger. For thus hath the Lord said, the whole land shall be desolate. Another reference, Isaiah. They that see thee, talking about Lucifer, they that see thee shall narrowly look upon thee and consider thee, saying, is this the man that made the earth to tremble, that did shake kingdoms, that made the world as a wilderness and destroyed the cities thereof, end quote. Isaiah 14:16 through 17. So what kingdoms, what cities are they talking about in this void era that were decimated by the judgment of God?
Right. Now, Derek, I want to get you in on this because you also believe that Jeremiah's verses are in reference to a pre-Adamic era, but in regard to the verses in Isaiah, you have another theory. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I think that, well, there are actually a couple things here at work. I think that God was clearly talking about a judgment that made the earth formless and void. But in Isaiah 14:17, the key to understanding this, I think, is knowing that the Hebrew word translated watchers is identical to the word meaning cities. So when who made the world like a desert and overthrew its cities, it was the understanding of the early church that there were angels, watchers, who had been delegated the responsibility for overseeing humanity. Is it possible we were seeing that this entity, Lucifer, actually came and overthrew or took down the loyal angels in kind of a supernatural war for control of this planet that God had created to give dominion to the children of Adam and Eve? Possible. Again, there are hints at this in Scripture. There are hints of other war in the heavenlies. But what all of this points to in my mind is that this supernatural war in which we have been deployed by God is a lot more convoluted, a lot richer than we have been taught, and it is far more real than most of us take it. Survey after survey shows that modern American Christians don't really believe in the supernatural. Most American Christians don't believe Satan, Lucifer is real. Forget about, demons. We stopped believing in them when we discovered psychiatry. This, I think, when we start looking at this and we look at the evidence in stone and consider the possibility that there have been more than one rebellion in this world, that there was a civilization beforehand that God had to punish and return the world to a pre-ordered state. yeah, I think we need to understand that we're in the middle of a war that the enemy is fighting for control of this planet and
Right.
for the ultimate destiny of us and everyone that we love.
And Derek, was it you or Mike Kaiser that once pointed out that the term that's being translated cities, in some contexts, could actually be translated as watchers? So going to fill the world with cities, but actually to fill the world with watchers.
Yeah, Mike made that point, and we took it and applied it to the Bible because, yes, there's another verse, Isaiah 14, where I think God is prophesying the ultimate destruction of this rebel that we call Lucifer. May the offspring of evildoers nevermore be named. Prepare slaughter for his sons. This would be, I think, reference to the Nephilim. Because of the guilt of their fathers, lest they rise and possess the earth and fill the face of the world with cities. And we see a similar verse in Numbers chapter 24, which is the prophecy of Balaam, where a star shall rise from Jacob, and ultimately he will crush the forehead of Sheth, the sons of Sheth, and destroy the survivors of cities, destroy the survivors of the watchers.
Yeah.
I think that makes more sense in context than cities. I mean, I'm from Chicago. What's wrong with cities?
Look, there are so many more things that are covered in the book. We don't even have time to get into. Like I mentioned earlier on, the out-of-place artifacts. I only talked about the Gate of the Sun. There's so many other things that are going on. First of all, multiple, completely encased in coal, by the way. The World Coal Association says that any particular coal took hundreds of millions of years to form. Their dating might be off. Let's assume that it is. It still was not formed yesterday. The bottom line is, if something is encased inside coal, completely surrounded by coal, how old is that artifact? And yet we have artifact after artifact after artifact pulled out of coal, in the middle of coal. People go into a coal mine, they get their coal, they take it home, they go to build themselves a fireplace, and a bell or a tooth or a fork falls out. You know, something that looks like an ancient fork. The question is, how old are these things? That's one of the biggest mysteries that we have in all of the whole world of archaeology, right? There are cart ruts all over the ancient planet, especially in Malta, but not limited to Malta.
Sardinia, yeah.
All over the place, linking somewhere around the ballpark of 12,000 BC mark is what the archaeologists suggest for that. And they see a religious astroarchaeological alignment to equinoxes and solstices and all kinds of serpentine worship they see coming out with that. We also have things that are not related to religion at all, like a fully functional sewer system that was installed 1,000 years before Göbekli Tepe, they are saying, which is like, what, really? 9,000-year-old skeletons found with proto-dentistry. They had fillings and drilled. These are things that were like, again, humanity could not construct a clay pot, but we've got these things. This could go on and on.
Right.
But let me get to the bottom line. This book was never written just to entertain people with really interesting facts.
Right.
That's not the line of work we're in. We have a very distinct evangelistic purpose. Now, let me explain how a book like this could even accomplish that, and I'll be brief. First of all, there is nothing wrong with being a scientist, studying science, taking into consideration scientific progress at all. But when a person comes to this idea that naturalistic evolution is the only thing that it describes all of us or whatever, they will call it by a different name, but at the end of the day, if science is your answer for everything, you are worshiping a God called science.
Yes.
Yeah.
Amen.
And at the end of the day, we have the generation of scientific progress right now, alive and well, walking the earth around us every single day. And the church is 300 years ago in the time of Galileo still saying, we don't know, it's just 6,000 years old, I don't know. We're not relevant. So this book is one way of taking old earth, young earth, science, and putting it all together and saying, this book called the Bible is relevant in this day. And look what happens next. If Genesis is relevant, then Genesis 3:15 and the promissory note of the coming Messiah gets relevant, and then
Real
Jesus
quick.
gets relevant fast.
Yeah.
Right.
Amen.
That is the
Amen.
point of this book.
Yeah, I love that so much. So this partly what we were doing, 'cause when Donna and I first started talking about producing this book, I had a lot of reasons why I wanted to do it, and I did want to entertain the difference between young and old Earth and all these out-of-place artifacts that are around the world and interesting stuff like Göbekli Tepe and all that. But at the end of the day, we thought, what would really be the main motivation here? And one, that's not the only one, but one of the main motivations was, go back a few weeks ago when I said, it bugged me when I was a pastor that you would have non-believers who felt like, well, I can't be a Christian because you guys are science deniers. You guys are the early forerunners of the Biden administration. So, and they just would not become a Christian. And I always looked at it and said, we're not denying any kind of real science, because if real science says that the earth is very old, I don't buy the line that God made it to look old in order to deceive us. That's heresy.
Yeah.
It is what it is, right?
Yeah.
But there was 6,000 years ago a recreation in Adam and Eve, so we agree actually. We actually take what the young earthers believe, what the old earthers believe, and what science, real science believes, and we put
Yeah.
it together in one volume. And now, if you're watching this program, you don't even know how you got here or why you are here, and you've always just said, well, those Christians, they're nuts. They deny science. Now you don't have an excuse anymore. Now you, welcome in, pilgrim.
That's right, that's right, that's right.
Jesus has a place for you.
What a great way to finish this series, but it really is just the beginning, ladies and gentlemen. You got to get your copy of Before Genesis. I think every pastor,
Yes.
every person you know in academia, every neighbor of yours, every youth pastor.
We only scratched the surface on
Oh my
6
gosh.
weeks of shows
6
as to
weeks.
what is in that book.
It's just, and barely any time on what lies beneath the companion DVD. It's too much. That's why you got to get the book.
Yeah.
But guys, thank you so much for taking time to be with us again here this week. Did you guys learn something? But for everybody here in studio, everybody on panel with me again this week, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Joe Artis Horn. Keep your eyes on the prize, which is Jesus Christ. We'll be back.